So thank you for joining us. This is CSC 353. Today's date is the 25th of January, Wednesday. And we are completing our content review for Module 1 in Systems Security. And I did want to share some points of interest along the way. Occasionally I get a chance to capture something that's interesting. This is the Xerox machine in the RT Park College of Science and Math department. And when you install the driver for the Xerox machine, what happens is that you get all sorts of extra features and functions. And if you just click around and go to like the advanced menu or whatever, and you click the more status, what happens is that a listing of completed jobs comes up from other users. And if you double click on these, like, hello, right? Everybody see this right here?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you double click on these, you can start to determine things like, okay, whose UVI 9000 number is this? And then you start looking at that information, you can start to determine who that belongs to. In other cases, it's not as much of a mystery. Here you see the name Castillo, right? So if any of you have had chemistry courses, and yeah, this information that was printed to the Xerox machine might not be a trade secret, but what about a W4? What kind of information does a W4 have?
Like work information and personal information.
Oh yeah, personal identity for taxes, right? So it's tax season. The point I'm trying to make is that system security, it's only as strong as the weakest link, right? Another thing that Xerox machines do very well, if you scan something or copy something, it can be sent to your email. And there's a service called SMTP Relay, Simple Mail Transport Protocol. In cases like this, it's often turned on so that the Xerox machine can beam a scan to somebody's inbox or email using email. And if that's turned on, people who are phishing or spamming can take over this kind of thing and use it to flood, to send lots and lots of spam, right? It's called an SMTP relay. So these are security challenges with respect to default settings. Why am I sharing this with you? It's not just a PC or a laptop that has default settings or a server that has default settings. There are all sorts of connected and intelligent devices that have default settings, and some of those default settings, well, they might expose a lot more information than you would want. Like somebody's bill, invoice, right? Ooh, what's that for? If I start double clicking on these things, I might just be able to open them. Many people don't realize that when a Xerox machine or a copier is destroyed and discarded, there's a hard disk down there that keeps a copy of everything that was copied, everything that was scanned, everything that was emailed, everything, because it's a big hard drive, which could involve some very sensitive information, right? Anyway, that's just something I thought I would share.
But there was an issue before where you could get the hard drive, and because there was a test system where it was connected to a network, I think it was on the older Windows systems where if you had a laptop that was already connected to the internet, you could backtrack to see what was the password last used. I'm not too sure if that's still an issue, but that is a lot of cases where if I forgot my password, I could just backtrack as it was the last password I used for a different network. And that's how I got into like a lot of the airports.
Yes. Hang on a second, please. I'll be right back. So we're back. Can everybody still see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Akeem, that was a great thing to share, and I'm glad you did, because there's a lot of fascinating exposures that have come up with copier machines, and a number of them have made it in the news. The one you mentioned specifically, or sometimes those are all tied into web browsers, because web browsers can save or retain older passwords for convenience purposes, and depending on the smart device it's tied into, the web interface is the way to go. And if those passwords are stored in a web browser, that can be problematic too. So you're touching on a variety of things that have been serious concerns with system security. And does anyone else have anything else to share about what we just presented?
Nope.
Okay, so what I wanted to do was to take a moment to pull out some, well, to call out some intentional concepts in our study guide addendum. So this is the study guide addendum, and we've already talked about how DAC is the most common form of access control that are used by individuals who have the discretion to decide who's going to read or execute or change my data and directories. But the simple truth is DAC also is deficient because the individuals that are exercising discretion are often making the permission and privilege changes based on user accounts directly. And so you're listing a person explicitly. And one thing about role-based access control that's superior is that you define a security group and a corresponding file system resource based on a group, and you change access by adding or removing members from the group. We'll talk about that more in greater detail in our next module. In chapter 1, we talked about TTP, and I think we brought this up before, but it's a good review in preparation for your module 1 assessment. We'll be posting that before the end of the week, and we want you to log your first attempt. The acronym TTP stands for Tactics, Techniques, and Procedures, and it's typically associated with an active actor, in particular, an advanced persistent threat, or APT. And the TTP is kind of like a signature. It's a pattern of tactics and techniques and procedures that kind of tips the hand of who's doing it, right? Because everybody attacks a system in their own unique way. And that signature can be helpful in identifying certain malicious actors. Some of the APTs that are out there on the FBI most wanted list, and yes, active malicious actors, advanced persistent threats, APTs, they're on the list. They're on the FBI most wanted list. They have a very predictable attack profile. And sometimes an attack profile is also referred to as an attack chain. And one aspect of system security is to break the chain of steps, the tactics, the techniques, and procedures. Just break one of those pieces of the chain, and then the malicious actor cannot make good on their threat. They can't finish the attack, right? Because what they needed to do wasn't possible. So you'll see that reference a lot in system security references, reference to an attack chain. Have any of you heard of the attack chain in cybersecurity circles before? So from student learning objectives D, E, and G, one of the things that we wanted to make sure people understood is that you have these system components, and if you don't have controls for each component of the system, you have gaps. So one of the important ideas behind system security best practices is that you take this comprehensive approach. If you look in the module 1 references folder, there's a picture of system components and gaps in between those components. In student learning objective F, there is reference to what's called a system footprint. This is the amount of exposure that's caused by running services, applications that are loaded, the amount of connections it has, because sometimes a system can have more than one network connection, more than one connection method. You can have Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and a variety of different things, right? So one good sense about a footprint you can get from the system manager. If you go in here and you see that there are 91 background processes running for applications, and that's just applications. And then I scroll down and I have 94 more that are running in Windows. Each one of those running services and processes represents a certain amount of activity that could have, each of which could have, you know, some kind of gap or exposure. Maybe there's a firewall rule that doesn't exist for one of these running services if it's a network service. Or maybe the wrong permissions are active for a specific process that's engaged for Windows. Those are the types of things that contribute to a system footprint. We talked about removing unnecessary applications. So when you look at the listing of applications, the fewer applications you use and need, the smaller the footprint. That includes the apps that are listed in the start menu, right? So this is another place where people forget to work or look. I don't have Disney listed here, but I have it here. So this is an exposure. And it's important to understand, you know, how many different, the more applications, the more apps you have, the more bugs, updates, patches, and fixes you need to concern yourself with, which makes it very difficult. Browser security by far is serious business because browsers are used for so much online. So it's possible between Edge and Chrome, and then you add what? Firefox. Oh, and then there's this new browser called Torch. It makes grabbing media off the internet so easy. So if you want bootleg movies, you install Torch. I didn't tell you that. Oh, and then there's the browser that you use with Tor for the dark web. Tor is an acronym that means the onion ring. Has anyone here ever heard of the onion ring?
Yeah.
So if people want to go basically the Tor project, if you want to get in the dark web, you want to be anonymous on the internet, you can use tools like Tor and the Tor browser. Well, those get to be significant exposures depending on where and what you're doing with them. And so the more stuff you have that's exotic, the bigger your footprint. Any questions about footprints and what that means?
No, sir.
It's the attack surface area, right? From chapter 3 in your text, it talks about access control, right? And historically, when you're talking about authentication, that's identity and access management. So the acronym IAM stands for identity and access management. Access control is part of that. So when we're talking about role-based access control or DAC, that has to do with permissions and privileges, but identity has to do with authentication. How do you authenticate? And traditionally, there were three basic classifications of authentication methods. Something that you know, password or a PIN code, something that you possess, a token or a key card. And some of you have an updated version of that. You have a smartphone. And if you have your smartphone with you, it can be a second, it's like a second token. If you have your smartphone and you can respond to the screen, does anybody have that? Anybody enjoy that feature?
I don't
Yeah.
think I have that.
Yeah, you have extra security for your like Gmail or for some of your logins. And so you have to put in a password, but then you also have to have that smartphone with you so you can tap it on the screen.
To
That's,
have like the thing is called second authentication.
yes, correct. Multi-factor,
Yeah,
it used to be
two-factor
called,
authentication.
yes, two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication is a best practice. And there isn't anyone that should not use, because it's become so easy, right? You want more than one authentication method. That's a great way to ensure systems security. And the third component is something that you are. So when we talk about what you are, your eyes are unique to you. So there's a retina pattern in your eye, or your footprint is unique. Of course, there are some classic hacks where people are circulating fingerprints of Michael Jackson, and then they like 3D print those on, so you see this in movies, right? Where people paste this layer of plastic that has somebody's fingerprint on it so you can defeat the biometric. But that's a third component, something that you are. One thing to understand is that identity access management is becoming so big and it's growing so fast, it's really kind of hard to keep up with all the different ways that you can authenticate now. But it's best to think about identity and account management as having two main components, one that's centered around the practice of account management and the other on effective authentication, right? And that those two pieces are what are needed in order to verify your identity. The other part of this is when you're talking about access, right? The thing that I want you to understand, it's not identity account management, it's identity access management. So the account is the virtual representation of the physical person. It's an abstraction. And then when it's entered, one of the things that's really kind of odd is that people use very plain account names. Like my account name right here, when I log in, I like to mix it up so that it's, when I'm typing in the value, I'm not just typing in my name and letters, it's something that's less obvious. But can everybody see this screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So identity access management has to do with accounts, and that's called a security principle. So one of the common points of confusion has to do with security components, and it's considered good form to understand. An identity factor has to do with authentication. You use an identity factor to prove you are who you say you are. That's two-factor or multi-factor authentication. So whenever you see identity factors, just remember, oh yeah, okay, you put a factor in when you're authenticating. Has to do with authentication. But a security account and groups, security groups where accounts can be members, right? that has to do with the virtual representation of the individual who then has to prove they are who they say they are, right? And most people don't realize it, but there are many different account types. We're familiar with user accounts, but how many of you did you know that there are computer accounts or system accounts?
I wasn't aware.
Now, a lot of people don't know that. There's a computer account, especially in a domain environment. There are service accounts. So there are accounts that are set up on a system, and they don't represent a person, they represent a running service. We just showed you in Task Manager, we have lots of services. Well, some of those require permissions, and it's a service account that works. If you're in a place where you have groups of systems or groups of users or groups of services that are related, like clustered services for an email server cluster or a database cluster, those things can be combined and managed by a special account called a managed service account. Now, a managed service account is really important because, in simple terms, you can use an account to authorize a service to run. What am I saying? Right now, I'm the only one that's logged in here, but let's open up computer management real quick. Can everybody see my screen yet?
Yes.
Can everybody see the services here?
Yep.
Yeah.
So let's pretend that I have a service associated with my Edge browser, right? It starts automatically, but if I right click this and go to properties, you can require or configure or design a service to require a specific account to log in. Now, if you're using an account and you have to authenticate, and passwords are the most common. Has anyone had to change their password lately?
No, not.
No, not yet.
But isn't it true that when you change your password, those requirements hit at the worst time? Yeah?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I mean, yeah, you're right in the middle of all sorts of stuff. And, you know, maybe it's finals week, or, you know, you have a deadline, or you have to work overtime hours. And it's like, really? Now I got to change my password? Shoot. Those things hit at the worst time. And if you have an account that's associated with a critical service, and it could be something like a network service that everybody depends on, DNS, right? Or how about this, iSCSI? That's a critical service. If you are using a network-based disk to run a server, you have to have, that has to be accessible all the time. The thing that I want to impress on you is that a managed service account is a special account that automatically changes the password every 30 days. So when you set up a service account and you make it a managed service account, it has an automatic password. It randomly creates a complex password, and it synchronizes the changes so that basically it keeps refreshing the encrypted password. And that's a good security measure for critical services. That's what managed service account is. And here's this little thing right here. When you have root or privileged accounts, that's called privileged account management. Okay, so that's a specialty unto itself. In security, among security professionals, there's a whole new type of interest, and you'll see references to IAM everywhere, right? Identity access management. There's a subset called privileged account management. How do you keep admin accounts or root accounts from becoming an Achilles heel, right? Because what happens is that a local admin account, if everybody in support department uses the same local login for support, then that can become an Achilles heel. So I just wanted to talk through some of the components of this dynamic. Now, identity access management also has started to include things like location. You try to log into something and you're in the Virgin Islands, but it's a login from Moscow, Russia. So you don't get to log in. Or you're supposed to log in on a system and you're in California. So the time zone is different. That means you can't log in, right? Any questions about this? Now, I basically call out some things here. How many of you know what a certificate is, right? Does everybody know what a certificate is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When we talk about a certificate, oftentimes we're talking about this little doolally right here. There's a encryption certificate, and that certificate is used to help secure the browser. That's where the padlock is. And I can look at that certificate. I can see specifics about the certificate. And because certificates are specific security factors, they can be used to authenticate or prove someone's identity. And that's a subtler point that not everybody understands. Inside your file explorer, when you're assigning privileges and permissions, each local account is assigned a special code or number. It's called a security identity or SID. And that is how the operating system keeps track of what account. They don't actually go by account names. They use a number when they're figuring out who has access to what. And that's just one finer point about this whole thing that is important to understand. Just remember that when you hear the term security principal, we're talking about accounts and groups. And there are all sorts of accounts. When we talk about identity factors, we're talking about how those accounts prove they are who they say they are. Any questions about this material?
Was there?
Okay, so now your textbook authors have added other authentication methods like performance biometrics. If we have machine hacks or artificial intelligence being used to crack through security measures, because they're automated, one of the things they want to do is they want people to perform a certain task. A favorite example is walking. Did you know that everybody has a different kind of step? Sometimes you have a little skip in your step. You know, females have a different walking gait compared to males. But the main point is that your walking gait, the way you look when you take the steps as you walk normally, that's called a gait. And if you videotape somebody walking, you can identify who they are based on how they stroll, right? It's pretty amazing. Performance biometrics also include voice ID. So this is different. This is kind of different than a fingerprint, right? So a fingerprint, you can't really change a fingerprint. And you can't really change the retina of your eye. But when you're talking, you're performing a vocal announcement in audio of a specific phrase. You have to perform it correctly. And if you do, then you go through CAPTCHA. Has everybody seen what CAPTCHA is?
Yeah.
Okay, and we just talked about certificates. So certificates would be considered like a fifth method. The more that we continue security challenges and workarounds, the greater the number of authentication methods are being created. And the important thing is to we talked about location, right? So there are all these different methods of saying, okay, somebody's using a credit card, but they're using it in China. And this is a credit card that belongs to somebody on St. Thomas. And so what's wrong with that picture? It has to do with location. Right now, it's 5 methods, but there's probably more every day. Okay. The important thing is to combine them. If you have hybrid or mixed scenarios, the factor of security goes way up. Now, in the student learning objective I for India, in your study guide, we talk about hashes. Passwords are never transmitted. When you enter a password, like when I do this, and I want to log in, and I have a password there, that password, that's not transmitted across the network. What happens is that a hash, an encrypted value of that password is calculated and created. And that hash is compared to a hash on the other end. And if the 2 hashes match, then access is granted. If they don't match, then access is denied. But I don't transmit the password. That's a no-no. A lot of people don't know that. Hash characters are combined with those that are stored in the system. So no plain text password characters are captured by hackers on a network. That used to happen. People used to type in their password and the hackers could see it like right on the network. That's pretty bad. Any questions?
No.
Speaking of passwords, there's a new tool for system security professionals. It's called a Bloom filter. And a Bloom filter has a table of hash values. And the table of hash values are bad password values. Didn't we pull up a screen that showed bad passwords in a previous session?
Yeah.
Okay. So what are we saying? If you're a security professional and you want to make sure that nobody's going to compromise your junk with a weak password, you can take their password hashes and you can run it against the Bloom filter, and the filter will go, okay, here's somebody using 111, 111. That's their 6-character. Really? That's your 6-character password? So you get to tap them on the shoulder and say, come on, you enjoy your job, right? Okay, you enjoy getting a paycheck, right? Maybe you don't enjoy your job, but you enjoy getting a paycheck, right? So if you don't pick a good password, you're not going to work here anymore, because a bad password means everybody's stuff gets stolen, including our bank accounts, which we use to do what? Oh, I don't know, create paychecks. Everybody understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Now there is a second encryption table. It's an encryption tool that's used with hashes, and it is extreme. What they do is they take all of the possible combinations for a given password of a length, and they calculate all of the possible combinations in advance. And then when somebody has a login, they just grab the hash and they look it up in the rainbow table, and they know what it is that was used to calculate it. So it's like a reverse lookup of your password. Rainbow tables are a very powerful but less common tool nowadays. It takes a lot of data. And then of course, hard drives are always getting bigger, aren't they? So maybe they're more common now. Did you know that you can use a USB drive as a token?
No.
You can put an encrypted value on it, right? So, we talked about privileged account management. One of the things about administrative accounts is that they should be at least 17 characters or more, lowercase, uppercase. numbers, and special characters. Hello. If an administrative or root account on a system is to be effective against the tools we were just talking about, a rainbow table for 17 or more characters is too big. Most hackers cannot afford it. Only countries, only very wealthy organized crime groups can have a rainbow table that's big enough to crack this. So if you have an administrative account for a server, if you're a systems administrator, or if you're support and you have administrative root accounts, those need to be, if you're using a password, this is one important thing I wanted to call out. It doesn't take a lot of fancy equipment to make a system secure, but if you have a very long password and it's complex, it's extremely hard to crack as long as it's changed every now and then. Now let's get back to the USB. You can install a USB drive to store an encrypted value, and it's used as a digital token for login. So if you go into accounts, right? If I go into here, and then go into accounts. Can everybody see this?
Yeah.
Info, sign in options, it's right here. I can create a PIN code, which can also include letters. So some of you are thinking, well, that's stupid. A password has numbers and letters. You can have a separate PIN code with numbers, and then you have a separate password with letters. You can use fingerprints. You can use a security key. When you use this option, or you can have your webcam take a picture of your face and facial recognition, that's getting better. But the security key is pretty cool. You can basically manage which apps require a security key, and you can create a security key. So you have to have the USB plugged in order to use an app. That's really cool. Those are things that are available now. So my question is, why aren't we using more of this then? Right? Now, remote user authentication is a special challenge. So when people are accessing their systems remotely, usually something called a virtual private network or a tunnel is recommended to protect remote access. And authentication is also a challenge across a distance because people are entering their login and their passwords, and it goes across the public internet. And so it's vulnerable while they're doing that. They have this special system called a radius server. It's a technology that helps improve the security of remote access. A radius server stands for remote access dial-in server. It hails back to the days where people would connect remotely with modems on a plain phone line. But the concept is still the same with regular Wi-Fi or modern networks. You're basically authenticating across a remote connection to a special server that contains extra authentication measures. So if that's hacked, the inside of your server in your office network is not hacked. Put another way, it's a special measure to work extra security measures for authentication when people are connecting across the internet. And if it blows up or it gets cracked, it's not the end of the world because the radius server knows how to clear people for access, but it doesn't have a lot of the inside guts. So if it's stolen or hacked, it causes a problem. That's why it's still considered a best practice, a radius server. You may or may not have heard about that. Okay. So the inside server inside the office that authenticates all the users in your organization, if that is centrally controlled, that's called a domain controller. Everybody, go ahead and say that, domain controller.
Domain controller.
Domain control.
Domain controller. A domain controller has to sit inside protected. You don't want it out by the internet, right? So if it holds all of the keys to authenticate everyone in your organization, that's one thing you don't want sitting close to the internet. And that's why the Radius server exists. Most organizations store the user accounts centrally instead of each system storing its own set of access accounts. This is called the Security Account Management Database, or SAM. You'll often see references to SAM. Okay. And as you can imagine, hackers love to try to get a hold of the SAM. If they can get a copy of the SAM, then they can start determining, okay, who has which accounts, what are their hashes, all that kind of business, right? A domain controller has everyone's account for the entire organization on all the systems. So it's kind of like the keys to all the castles. That's a central security account management model. It's not a standalone. So that's something that we'll be talking about more in detail in the next module. But I did want to cover this last point, is that in student learning objective L, what we were just talking about, the login credentials are what we call the keys, right? Those are which? Security principles or security factors? That's a trick question. Login credentials include the account, which is a security principle, and include the authentication, the password or key or PIN code, whatever, USB drive. Those are the security factors. Both of those together create this idea that we call the login credentials. When somebody's asking you for your login credentials, they need the account and the password, okay? The solution to manage these effectively has to do with that domain controller. But two important things about the domain controller: you never put them near the public network in a DMZ. Has anyone ever heard of the term DMZ?
No.
So a DMZ is a screened network. It's filtered by a firewall, and it's where your public systems are placed. In simple terms, now let's give you a picture. So I'm going to search for the term DMZ, screened network firewall, and let's just get some images here. So we got to pick the right one. This is a good one right here. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Yeah.
So in most cases, you have an internal network where everybody is working inside the fort. Out here is the internet, and you have a firewall. A DMZ is called a demilitarized zone. That's what the acronym stands for. But what it really is a separate network, and it's filtered through the firewall for extra security. And this is where you have things like your email and file servers and web servers. The things that people have to access on the internet, when they access it, they're getting into here. But when they get on the web server, if a hacker compromises the email server or hacks into the web server, they're not inside here where the domain controller and everybody's private data is. So this is called a screened network or demilitarized zone. It's kind of like a safe zone with extra security. That's what the term DMZ means. The important thing to remember is that this idea is standard practice. And you never, ever, ever put a domain controller out here so that people can remote in. You just don't do it. And why are we saying that? Because some people have actually done that. It's crazy, I know. So a domain controller must never be visible to devices outside the internal network. This is why you have a perimeter network. Now, a perimeter network is a network that's out on the edge or perimeter. Sometimes it's called an edge network. And that perimeter or edge network is closest to the public network. So perimeter, it's out on the perimeter, it's out on the border, it's out by the fence. If the firewall is sort of like a digital fence, a perimeter network is right on the fence. And the public network can get at the stuff that's sitting on the edge or on the fence or on the perimeter. An internal network is supposed to be private and protected. And it's designed differently so that people that hack in here can't get in there. And that's something that's really, really important to understand. So when you see the term perimeter, what we're talking about is that network that's out with public systems, that's close to the internet, and it's connected. The other thing I want to share with you too is if you have your own web server and your own email, the inside people can get to their own web server, they can get to their own email, but that's as far as it goes. They can't, so there are barriers, right? So inside folks can get at what they need, outside folks can get what they need. The two aren't mixing. That's called network segmentation. That's a way of securing things. Well, our time is up. Would anyone can anyone think of a question or a point of curiosity you'd like to share based on the information we just presented?
I have one. If anybody have one, could you teach us how to use or set up the USB so that we could get access to the computer, like instead of a password?
The short answer is yes. I can show you how to use the USB to, in fact, let's take this a step further. How about if I walk through how to do that and then we post an assignment and everybody gets to practice it and you get credit for doing it?
Okay, cool.
Sure.
Okay. Now, does everybody have access to a spare USB?
Yes.
Yes.
Does the file size matter?
It doesn't matter. The file size doesn't matter. It can be a smaller, older one. But the thing that I would tell you is that if it's a smaller, older one and it's a spare and it doesn't have much life left, and then your login depends on it, it might, I mean, just to try it to see how it works, you can set it up and then you can turn it off. But if you want to use it all the time, then I would suggest getting a brand new one, just so that it's fresh. You don't have to have a big one.
Okay, cool.
But because it's new, it'll last longer and you'll have fewer problems with it. That's a great question, and I appreciate you asking it. So I'll tell you what, we will add like a extra credit assignment to module 1. And if everybody brings a USB on Friday, we'll walk through it on Friday. How's that?
Cool.
Great.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Any other questions you can think of based on the information we've presented today?
Yeah. So we could use a USB and a password as sort of like a two-factor authentication.
That's much more secure. It is two-factor authentication. If you use a password and a USB, it's a lot harder to crack in. Here's a helpful tip. we have slides from the author in the references folder. And instead of going through all of the slides first, go to the summary slides at the end, because the most important information is listed. And then go back and look at some of those slides, right? So that helps you get through the material a lot faster and more efficiently. And the main ideas are in those summary slides, right? Just a helpful tip. We have chapter 1 and chapter 3 slides for this module. Okay. We'll stop sharing and recording.